Spindizzy Worlds. This was a game that I first saw on a random game competition on Twitch 10 years ago. And my initial response to that was, is this an Amiga game on the Super Nintendo? I genuinely don't know how to better explain it, but I just get a feeling when I see certain games that are just like, yeah, that's definitely an Amiga game that they just moved onto a 16-bit system, and I've got a couple Genesis games that are like that too. I can't really explain how I know this. It's just sort of like a gut feeling. It might just be the palette they choose for their art. I'm genuinely not sure how to better explain it. But yeah, this is sorta kind of a port of the second Spindizzy game, Spindizzy 2, except on the Super Nintendo. It's also worth noting that while this is kind of the fourth game in the series, it's also the last iteration of it. But it's a pretty interesting game. I think this is a game you could have a lot of fun with, provided you're prepared to meet it on its level, because it is not a fantastically made game. That said, while you can hear the Super Nintendo grunt and wheeze in trying to make this game, it does feel almost like a miracle this game works at all. And it's a fun one. The plot to Spindizzy Worlds is pretty simple, in that it's pretty much told to you exclusively on the front page, along with lava burns. That's useful information. Hold on a sec, I need to write that down. Lava burns. Got it. Along with various enemies in the game and things you have to collect, including the fact that there's an enemy that looks like a thing you have to collect. I'm sure that's a good decision. But either way, you play as Gerald, the Geographical Environmental Reconnaissance and Land Mapping Device. First of all, that's eloquent. Whoever came up with that, I applaud you. But second of all, land mapping should be hyphenated. Just saying. Either way, Gerald is a spinny top that has big blue stripes on it to help it not turn invisible half the time, despite the game desperately trying to let you. Again, this game's got a few issues, but his job is to go to various planets, go around, I guess, mapping them, and then watch them explode. Because when you're done mapping them, you destroy them. That's your lot for a plot. I hope you enjoyed. This is definitely a game that is focusing more on the arcade action experience, and not so much on telling a deeply rooted and meaningful story. Indeed, there isn't really any story. Like I said, it's kind of taught to you on little sticky notes on the title screen. But either way, you at least have a character, and your job is to make sure Gerald doesn't die as he maps planets before he watches them burn. Now, when you start Spindizzy World, you get to select two possible scenarios: Easy Dizzy and Spindizzy. Now you'd think, quite rightly so, that Easy Dizzy might serve as sort of a tutorial of sorts, and that would make sense. I mean, the first level of it shows you all the different buttons and switches and how they kinda work, at least in theory. If you choose, the regular mode, every time you select a stage, this game will be more than happy to remind you that basic things, such as falling damages you, and you need fuel or you die. So yeah, you just get tutorialized no matter what you do, pretty much on every planet you go to. When you finally get into the first stage you play, oh god, what is this? Okay, I'm not sure how well this is gonna translate, but there's an ungodly amount of delay between input and action in this game. We're talking about a second between any input actually doing anything, except for stopping. Weirdly enough, there's a button that's just the brakes, and they will stop you on a dime. And on the harder levels, you need to be able to do that, or you will not be able to complete those stages. But yeah, there's just an ungodly amount of lag in here, and the moment anything on screen starts moving and isn't you, well, first of all, it's entirely hostile, because you're pretty much the only moving thing that isn't, but also it chugs even harder and it controls even worse. And what compounds this problem, yeah, there's ice physics everywhere. Everything controls very, very slippery and floaty. Everything just controls in very, very broad arcs of momentum, because momentum is such an important thing in this game. Unfortunately, pretty much everything about how this game controls on a physics level leads to an entire lack of feeling of precision. You know what this game is built heavily on? That one thing that it doesn't have. Especially on the harder stages outside of Easy Dizzy, you're gonna need precision in your controls, and you just don't have it. And yet, in spite of that, I was still having fun playing this. for the most part. If I were to try and encapsulate all of Spindizzy World's gameplay into a single word, it would probably be inconsistent. There are so many things in this game that just feel like out of left field and you just sort of have to adapt to it. Ostensibly, Gerald goes into every single world and has to clear a couple of rooms each by collecting a bunch of gems. Once he collects those gems, he'll activate a teleporter and move on to the next area until eventually he's cleared the world. Except not always. So let's start out with those gems. You know, those gems, the core keys to opening up every single room so that you can move on. Yeah, sometimes you don't need to collect them. There's just a teleporter that works sometimes. Sometimes the teleporter you need to go in is where you entered for reasons. Sometimes those gems that you're collecting aren't gems at all. Sometimes they're Pac-Man pellets that make a gulping noise when you collect them. Sometimes they're little pyramids that look like enemies that look like little pyramids, but they're littler pyramids, so don't worry about it. You'll definitely not get those confused. Definitely. Sometimes they're just flags, and there's not really a reason or an explanation as to why. You know, considering that basically everything in this game is sort of an abstract concept in a very generic shape, enemies and objects you need to collect included, having consistency might have helped, because aside from the fact that they're not actively chasing you, you know, I don't think it's entirely unreasonable to assume that some of these collectibles might have been enemies, or that you even could collect them in the first place. And there doesn't seem to be too much of a sensible reason as to why they're different, aside from them making different sound effects when you pick them up, and I think the flag gives you a small bit of invulnerability, but I never collected one in a situation where I'd take damage to really find out. You might notice that this game is isometric, and isometrics are always a tricky thing to deal with because, first of all, things will always get lost in the camera perspective. Well, don't worry, because the developers tried to solve this problem. They didn't really succeed, but they tried. You can slap L and R on your controller to rotate the camera. But here's the problem. First of all, you're only rotating at 90-degree angles, so you still don't have all that much control on it, but, you know, it's a Super Nintendo game. I can't expect them to give us full 360-degree camera control now, can I? But at the same time, when you do that, the game kind of just stops and sits for a few seconds, and then a black screen happens, and then it kind of like loads the entire world around you again. It's almost like the game is actively unloading and then reloading it just from a different perspective. I have no idea why, and yeah, there's kind of loading screens in this game, because Amiga game on Super Nintendo. But even if that wasn't the issue, there's the fact that there's such a delay between you actually doing it to seeing the result, that if the 90-degree shift wasn't already completely disorienting, you might not be able to actually see what you're looking at. And you might have to do this 2 or 3 times, having to wait for the rotation to load and unload until you get to where you need to go, because you might need to angle the camera 180 degrees. And that can be really disorienting. But you can't always do that either. You can only do that sometimes, because I don't know why. When you clear a level, you're taken to a bonus stage where you have to collect gems under a time limit, and you can just fall off and finish early, except sometimes you can't. Heck, if you want to talk about the game being really inconsistent, instead of just teleporting to random new maps, there was one stage that was basically just built as a single fortress, built entirely with floors built vertically on top of each other that you could move freely between in sort of an open world exploration to solve the greater puzzle of the map itself. It led to some confusing bits, however, where if you'd go up a ramp, it would almost look like you could take a path, but it wouldn't. It would just sort of stop the game, freeze it for a minute, and then load a new map that you had to move on. So, you know, it was hard to understand what information the map was conveying at the time because of that, but it's interesting that it was willing to experiment a little bit with that as well. This game is kind of wildly inconsistent in its gameplay. Sometimes you don't even need to take a teleporter to activate the next area. Sometimes you just need to collect the gems and you just move on. There's no consistency with every single stage. You just sort of have a vague general understanding that there's things you sometimes need to collect, and it's in your best interest to do it, so hopefully you can figure it out. Sometimes buttons don't actually do things and are just there to distract you from other buttons, and sometimes those buttons just undo the thing that the button you hit did. I get that this is for puzzle solving and whatever, but some of the times it just feels like their use of buttons is just there to pad out time instead of, you know, for a sensible reason that actually actually makes it engaging. And again, it entirely feels inconsistent. There's lots of aliens in this game, although really they're just things that move that you can't collect. They usually serve to exist as obstacles in stages. Sometimes they'll chase you around, although they are fairly dumb and follow fairly rudimentary patterns. Most of the time they're pretty much just moving in straight lines back and forth, patrolling, or entirely stationary. When you hit them, of course, you take damage, but fortunately they'll despawn. Except that they'll respawn, and at least on the harder difficulties, that respawn can be instantaneous. And if you happen to hit them while they respawn where they respawn, you're gonna take multiple hits of damage, because there's basically no invulnerability. So that's less than good. Sometimes there are ramps to build up speed, which can be useful to cross gaps. However, unless you're using the speed up button, you can just fall off the ramp and die, and respawn on that ramp with the ramp's physics already taking hold, falling off and dying again, and again, and again. And I'm not afraid to admit I game overed just because the physics decided, nope, we're gonna respawn you right here, basically in the pit. That's not a fun feeling. Going fast and using those ramps to jump gaps, that's fun, that's exhilarating. Sitting here on this sort of awkward slant, just dropping into a pit because you respawn there and you're not holding the speed up button, that just feels like almost a sense of hopelessness encapsulated into a single moment. Once you get out of, the tutorial mode easy dizzy into Spindizzy, you realize that this game only has two settings. Really, really easy but approachable, and ungodly hard. How hard is it? Well, the first stage in Spindizzy is a world called Beginner. I could not finish that level. Fortunately, this means I can show off the stage select, because you can rotate the worlds and select whatever stage you want. Sort of. It's kind of using a layered system, so you have to handle worlds on the outer layers before you can handle ones on the inner layers, but still, you can select your level and try something different if the stage you're on doesn't work, and that's actually really, really cool. Unfortunately, most of the stages in Spindizzy are really freaking hard. I think there's something like 20 levels in Spindizzy, and I could only take maybe half of them. But in trying to attempt every single level I could possibly access, I noticed that every stage in Spindizzy takes like one of 3 different stage concepts. Either a stage is designed to have a very, very tight time limit that you need to act on, which with ice physics and delayed controls and really, really punishing environments, that's a bit of a challenge, certainly. There are stages that are designed around really absurd platforming that you probably won't be able to see half the stuff because all the environments sort of blend into one another. Again, isometrics not the best, and when you have to do a fast execution of stuff just to get through an environment, that's a bit of an issue, and you'll frequently run into like hidden pits and stuff that you just can't see because the tiles just sort of blend into one another. That's not so good. The third concept are the stages I really enjoyed in Spindizzy, and that are just generally very large environments to explore and puzzles to solve. I'm an explorer and collector by trade, so, these stages really did something for me, for the most part. But the fact that they primarily rely on these 3 key concepts for their stage designs, at least in the Spindizzy half of the game, it feels a little boring, especially when you're going into a new stage and you're like, yeah, I can't wait to go play this, and it turns out to be like one of those really awkward execution challenges that you don't necessarily gel all that well with. Certainly, it's a challenging game, but if you're willing to meet that challenge, you'll find a lot to like here. But it is a very difficult game, and not necessarily in a way that feels fair, just because the game's controls are very frustrating, and because environments are sometimes built in such a way that you can't even see where you're going and you just fell into a pit and died. And that sucks. That said, the game itself does utilize a lot of a very basic concept. You're at top, you need to collect things and get to the exit. Sometimes there's buttons to hit to activate things, sometimes there's platforms that move around, don't fall too far, or you break, but hey, maybe there'll be trampolines to bounce on. Or sometimes there's ice physics that if you sit on for long enough, you just die instantly, I'm guessing as an anti-soft locking measure. It feels like the stages themselves took very, very simple concepts and just refined them to an extreme. And I do appreciate that. I just wish they toned down the difficulty maybe a little bit and made their stages a little bit more sensible for the end user experience to better approach the challenge, because falling into a pit you didn't see because the tiles that are sort of like layered above the tiles you're on looking identical, which looks like a flat path, but oh no, there's a pit you didn't see because everything looks flat but it isn't. That's no fun. Overall, Spindizzy Worlds is a complicated beast to talk about. It's challenging and it doesn't necessarily feel fair at times, but if you like arcade games and you're willing to meet it on its own level, I think you could really enjoy this game. This feels like sort of the logical missing link between something like Marble Madness and Monkey Ball, at least insofar as you're going through vaguely Euclidean environments to get to an end goal before time runs out or you die. But yeah, I'm not necessarily good at this, especially on the harder stages, but in spite of how unfair it felt at times just because of some wonky environmental stuff or some control stuff, I still had fun with it. The overall presentation to Spindizzy Worlds leaves a lot to be desired. Like I said, visually, it looked like an Amiga game to me, and that's kinda because it is. I feel like the overall palette could use a lot of work. Like I said, in the gameplay, it actively holds this game back from being approachable for players, and it brings down the entire experience when you run into environments where the tiles sort of blend into one another. Or, you know, Gerald blends in with the tiles and just turns invisible sometimes. It's frustrating and annoying to just lose track of where you are, lose what the stage is. I remember running into one of the stages where it was basically entirely ice, and I couldn't figure out why I couldn't get to where I needed to go, partially because I couldn't rotate the camera, but also because there was an entire vertical pillar in front of me that I just couldn't see because it matched the tiles below it. I feel like they could have probably done more with the visuals of the Super Nintendo, or at least use a more varied palette so that stuff doesn't blend into itself so much. That said, there are some unique environments. I remember there was one stage that looked like it was made entirely of Lego, and that's because it was trying to look like, what was that one game, Pack Attack? I think that was even the stage name. There's a lot of different enemies as well, although a lot of them are just sort of vaguely defined concepts more than actual enemies themselves. That said, they are varied, and that's appreciated. Audio-wise, when I looked at this game, I didn't think the soundtrack was going to be all that special, and while certainly not a top-tier Super Nintendo soundtrack, some of the songs on this were actually pretty good. Some of the songs are really upbeat and almost sound like a song you'd hear at like a carnival or something, and some of them felt quite sort of serene and ambient. You know, it feels like you're in these weird, lonely, alien environments, and it just works. Maybe even for something like Metroid. I'm not sure it's one of the more memorable ones, but it's definitely a step above the visuals, by far. Now, if you want a copy of Spindizzy Worlds on the Super Nintendo, cheapest North American copy I see is $30. And that's definitely a bit high for the experience. I think I ended up paying maybe $10, if that. And certainly if you can get it on discount, I would be more readily able to recommend it. And if you happen to be interested in this kind of game, I actually found two other games that are kinda like it, but a bit more modern. On the Game Boy Advance, there was a Beyblade game that looked a bit like this, although more action-oriented. I want to say it was called Ultimate Blader Jam. And I actually found a Steam game that's very similar called Topsy Turvy, and I picked that one up for pretty cheap just to get some footage of it, and it's kind of similar as well. Basically, if you like this game, while there isn't a new Spindizzy out there, there are a few games out there kind of keeping the torch. But I still do recommend this game, with some asterisks. First of all, this is a game you're definitely going to have to meet more than halfway to enjoy, I think. It's a very fun game, it's a very challenging game, but a lot of that challenge doesn't necessarily feel like it's fair or like it's there by intent so much as this is just how the game works, just sort of deal with it. And the fact that you kind of have to work around the muddy controls and the somewhat awkward physics, the very awkward respawning system at times, and the overall inconsistency of the experience, that makes it harder to recommend. Still fun, but harder. But if you like arcade action games or execution challenges, if you like Monkey Ball or Marble Madness, you should try and experience Spindizzy Worlds, because it does feel like the missing link in a series that you'd really enjoy. It's a game that you have to put in the effort to really understand. It's definitely a game that's frustrating and is going to take a lot of time to get used to and really gel with, but I think if you like arcade games, Spindizzy Worlds is one to look into. And I'm not just saying that because Gerald threatened to blow up the world if I didn't.